20 years of loyalty, sacrifice, and dedication meant nothing when Richard Blackwood walked into my office on that gray Tuesday morning in March. I was Margaret Chen, Senior Operations Director at Meridian Financial Solutions, and I thought I had job security that couldn't be shaken. I was wrong. What happened next would expose a web of corruption so deep that it would bring down not just my boss, but half the executive team. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning, because what Richard did to me was just the tip of the iceberg. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The morning everything changed like any other. I arrived at Meridian Financial Solutions at 7:30 sharp, just like I had every weekday for the past 2 decades. The Seattle office building hummed with its usual energy as employees filtered in with their coffee cups and morning conversations. I took the elevator to the 15th floor, nodding to familiar faces as I made my way to my corner office overlooking Elliott Bay. At 52, I had worked my way up from an entry-level analyst position to Senior Operations Director. Meridian Financial Solutions wasn't just my employer, it was my second home. I knew every process, every client relationship, every regulatory requirement that kept our mid-sized investment firm running smoothly. My team of 37 employees looked to me for guidance, and I took pride in mentoring young professionals who reminded me of myself when I first started. Richard Blackwood had been CEO for 8 years, taking over when the company founder retired. He was a tall man with prematurely gray hair and an expensive suit collection that he wore like armor. Richard had always been cordial with me, professional but distant. He appreciated the results, and I delivered them consistently. Our quarterly reviews were predictable affairs, where he'd acknowledge my department's performance with measured praise before moving on to the next agenda item. That Tuesday morning, I was reviewing the quarterly compliance reports when my assistant, Jennifer Walsh, knocked on my door. Her usually cheerful expression looked strained. "Margaret, Mr. Blackwood wants to see you in his office immediately," she said, her voice carrying an unusual tension. I glanced at my calendar. Our quarterly meeting wasn't scheduled until Thursday. "Did he say what it's about?" Jennifer shook her head. "He just said it was urgent." I gathered my files and made the familiar walk down the hallway to the executive suite. Richard's office occupied the building's corner, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of downtown Seattle. His assistant, Patricia Romano, gestured toward the closed door without her usual warm greeting. "Go right in, Margaret. He's waiting." I knocked once and entered. Richard sat behind his mahogany desk, but he wasn't alone. A young man I didn't recognize occupied one of the leather chairs facing the desk. He looked to be in his late 20s, with carefully styled brown hair and a navy suit that looked freshly pressed. Something about his posture, the way he sat back in the chair like he owned it, immediately put me on edge. "Margaret, please sit down," Richard said, gesturing to the empty chair beside the stranger. His tone was businesslike, but there was something underneath it that I couldn't quite identify. I sat down and waited. The silence stretched for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. "I'll get straight to the point," Richard began. "The company is restructuring the operations department. We're implementing a new organizational structure that will better serve our growth objectives." My stomach tightened. Restructuring usually meant layoffs, and as department head, I'd typically be involved in such discussions from the beginning. This was the first I was hearing of it. "I see," I said carefully. "What kind of restructuring are we talking about?" Richard's eyes didn't quite meet mine. "We're creating a new position, Chief Operations Officer. This role will oversee all operational functions with expanded authority and strategic responsibility." I felt a flutter of excitement despite my confusion. A promotion to COO would be a natural progression after 20 years of dedicated service. It would mean more responsibility, better compensation, and recognition for everything I'd built in the operations department. That sounds like an excellent opportunity, I said. When do we start the transition process? Richard's expression didn't change, but the young man beside me shifted in his chair. That's when I noticed the slight smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. Margaret, I'd like you to meet Tyler Blackwood, Richard said. He'll be our new Chief Operations Officer. The words hit me like a physical blow. Tyler Blackwood. The surname wasn't a coincidence. I looked between Richard and the young man, pieces clicking into place with sickening clarity. Tyler is my stepson, Richard continued, his voice steady and professional, as if he were discussing quarterly earnings. He recently completed his MBA at Northwestern and has extensive experience in operational efficiency consulting. I stared at Tyler, trying to process what I was hearing. This 20-something had just been handed the position I'd been working toward for 2 decades. Not only that, but he'd be my superior, overseeing the department I'd built from the ground up. I don't understand, I managed to say. What happens to my current role? You'll be transitioning to a new position as Senior Operations Analyst, Richard said. You'll report directly to Tyler and provide him with the institutional knowledge he'll need to succeed in his new role, Senior Operations Analyst. It was a title I'd held 15 years ago. The demotion was so dramatic it was almost insulting. They were asking me to train my replacement, a kid who'd just stepped out of business school and into a corner office based solely on his family connection. Richard, I've been with this company for 20 years, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I've increased operational efficiency by 37%, reduced compliance violations to 0, and built a team that consistently exceeds performance targets. I don't understand how someone with no experience in our industry can just step into a senior leadership role. Tyler spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the confident tone of someone who'd never been told no. Mrs. Chen, I appreciate your concerns, but I think you'll find that fresh perspectives often bring innovative solutions. My consulting experience has given me insights into operational optimization that could benefit Meridian significantly. The way he said Mrs. Chen, formal but somehow condescending, made my teeth clench. I'd been Margaret to every executive in this building for years. Now I was being relegated to formal address by someone young enough to be my son. What consulting? Experience? I asked, looking directly at him. Tyler's confidence wavered slightly. I worked with Hartwell & Associates for 18 months, focusing on process improvement for mid-sized financial firms. Hartwell & Associates. I knew the firm. They were a boutique consulting group that primarily hired recent MBA graduates to do PowerPoint presentations for clients who wanted to justify changes they'd already decided to make. 18 months of making slides hardly qualified as extensive experience. And before that, I pressed, graduate school, and before that I worked in business development for a tech startup in Chicago. So he had less than 3 years of actual work experience, none of it in a leadership role, and Richard was handing him control of a department that managed $43 million in operational budget. I see, I said, looking back at Richard. And this decision is final? It is, Richard replied. The transition will begin immediately. Tyler will need you to brief him on all current projects, vendor relationships, and team dynamics. I'm counting on your professionalism to make this as smooth as possible. Professionalism. After 20 years of loyalty, he was asking me to smile and nod while they handed my career to his stepson. I thought about my mortgage, my daughter's college tuition, my retirement savings that still needed another decade of contributions to be adequate. I thought about the job market for 52-year-old women in finance, especially ones who'd been demoted after 2 decades with the same company. I understand, I said. Because what else could I say? When do you need the transition? Plan. End of the week, Tyler interjected. I'd like to hit the ground running next Monday. 5 days. They were giving me 5 days to hand over 20 years of institutional knowledge to someone who probably couldn't find the employee handbook without GPS. The meeting concluded with Richard outlining my new salary. a 30% reduction. That would make my mortgage payments challenging, and my new office assignment. I was moving from my corner office to a cubicle on the 12th floor. Not even a private office. A cubicle, like I was starting over as a junior analyst. I walked back to my soon-to-be former office in a daze. Jennifer was waiting with a stack of messages and a concerned expression. "How did it go?" she asked. I looked at her. This bright 26-year-old who'd been my assistant for 3 years. She was everything I'd been at her age. Ambitious, hardworking, optimistic about corporate America's merit-based promises. "Pack up my personal items," I said quietly. "I'm moving to the 12th floor." Her face fell. "Margaret, what happened?" I couldn't bring myself to explain it all. Instead, I asked her to cancel my afternoon meetings and began the surreal process of summarizing 2 decades of work into a transition document for someone who'd never managed a team, never handled a regulatory audit, and never had to explain, to a room full of investors, why operational costs had increased by 2%. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Over the next 3 days, I watched Tyler Blackwood settle into what had been my career trajectory. He moved into the office next to Richard's, an office that had been empty for years because Richard claimed it wasn't necessary. Suddenly, it was not only necessary but required renovation. Tyler had specific requests for furniture, lighting, and technology that would cost more than my old salary increase had been worth. The irony wasn't lost on me. They claimed budget constraints prevented them from promoting me over the years, but they found money to redecorate an office for the boss's stepson. I spent hours briefing Tyler on our client portfolio, regulatory requirements, and team management strategies. He took notes on an expensive tablet, nodding along as I explained complex compliance procedures and vendor relationships that had taken years to establish. His questions revealed a superficial understanding of financial operations, but he had the confidence of someone who'd never failed at anything significant. "This seems pretty straightforward," he said, after I'd spent 2 hours explaining our quarterly SEC reporting process. "I think we can probably streamline a lot of these procedures." Streamline. It was consultant speak for change things without understanding why they exist in the first place. I bit my tongue and continued the briefing. On Thursday, I was introduced to my new supervisor, Diana Martinez, the senior analyst manager who would oversee my work. Diana was a capable woman in her early 40s who'd been with the company for 8 years. The awkwardness of the situation was painful for both of us. She'd been reporting to me just days earlier, and now she had to figure out how to manage someone who'd been her boss. "Margaret, I want you to know this is weird for me too," she said when we met privately. "I don't understand what's happening here, but I'll try to make this work for both of us." Diana's honesty was refreshing. At least someone was acknowledging that the situation was insane. My new cubicle was a standard 6x6 workspace with gray fabric walls and fluorescent lighting. I'd gone from a corner office with a view of Elliott Bay to a desk facing a wall decorated with motivational posters about teamwork. The symbolism was so heavy-handed, it would have been funny if it weren't happening to me. The worst part was watching my former team try to navigate the change. These were people I'd hired, trained, and mentored. Some had been with me for over a decade. Now they had to report to Tyler, who scheduled mandatory meetings to discuss optimization opportunities and synergistic efficiencies. Marcus Thompson, my former deputy director, stopped by my cubicle on Friday afternoon. He was a sharp 41-year-old who'd been instrumental in developing our risk management protocols. "Margaret, can I ask you something?" he said, glancing around to make sure we weren't overheard. "Of course. What the hell is happening here?" I appreciated his directness. "Honestly, Marcus, I wish I knew. All I can tell you is that Tyler is your new boss, and we all need to figure out how to make this work." He called a meeting yesterday to discuss right-sizing our human capital allocation, Marcus said. Do you know what that means? I did know what it meant, but I couldn't say it out loud. Right-sizing was corporate euphemism for layoffs. Tyler was planning to cut staff in a department that was already operating at optimal efficiency. Just focus on doing your job well, I told Marcus. Document everything, meet your deadlines, and stay professional. It was the same advice I was giving myself, but it felt hollow. How do you stay professional when professionalism has gotten you demoted in favor of nepotism? Friday evening, I sat in my empty corner office for the last time. The view of Elliott Bay was spectacular as always, with the late afternoon sun casting golden light across the water. I'd spent thousands of hours in this room, working late into the evening, coming in on weekends, missing family dinners and school events because I believed that dedication and results would be rewarded. Jennifer knocked on the doorframe. The gal. Moving crew is here to pack up your things. I nodded and took one last look around. 20 years of my life were being reduced to boxes that would fit in a cubicle. As I watched the movers dismantle my professional life, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to find out exactly how Tyler Blackwood had convinced his stepfather to hand him a six-figure executive position. Something about this whole situation didn't add up, and I had nothing left to lose by asking questions. What I discovered would expose corruption that went far beyond simple nepotism. But that investigation would have to wait until Monday, when I'd begin my new life as a senior analyst reporting to someone who thought synergy was more than just a buzzword. The weekend stretched ahead of me, 48 hours to process the most humiliating professional experience of my life. I had no idea that by Monday afternoon, I'd stumble across information that would turn my demotion into the least of Richard Blackwood's problems. Monday morning in my new cubicle felt like the first day of school after summer vacation, except, instead of excitement, I felt a gnawing sense of displacement. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I arranged my few personal items on the small desk. My framed photo of my daughter's college graduation looked out of place next to the standard-issue computer monitor. Diana Martinez appeared at my cubicle. Entrance at 8:15, coffee in hand and an apologetic smile on her face. "Morning, Margaret. I know this is awkward, but I've got your first assignment." She handed me a manila folder. Tyler wants a comprehensive review of all vendor contracts in the operations department. He's looking for cost-cutting opportunities. I opened the folder and scanned the contents. These were contracts I'd negotiated and maintained for years. Every vendor had been carefully vetted, their services essential to our operations. The idea that Tyler could identify meaningful savings after a weekend of PowerPoint slides was laughable. "When does he need this?" I asked. "End of the week?" Of course he did. Tyler was establishing a pattern of unrealistic deadlines that would make everyone scramble to meet his arbitrary demands. It was a classic power play from someone who didn't understand the actual work involved. As I began reviewing the vendor files, I couldn't help but overhear conversations from the nearby cubicles. The operations team was struggling to adapt to Tyler's management style. He'd implemented daily status meetings that accomplished nothing except eating into productive work time. He'd also introduced a new project tracking system that duplicated existing processes without improving efficiency. Around 10:30, I received an email from Tyler requesting all historical performance data for the operations department dating back 5 years. He wanted metrics, charts, and trend analysis delivered by Wednesday morning. It was the kind of comprehensive report that typically took my team 2 weeks to compile properly. I walked up to the 15th floor to speak with Marcus Thompson. His expression darkened when he saw me approaching. "Margaret, thank God you're here. Tyler just assigned us 3 new reports that need to be completed by Thursday. None of us understand what he actually wants, and he keeps using terms that don't make sense in our context." "What kind of terms?" "He wants us to ideate around operational paradigms and leverage synergistic workflows. I've been in this business for 16 years, and I have no idea what that means." I recognized the language from Tyler's consulting background. He was applying generic business terminology to specific operational challenges, creating confusion instead of clarity. Do your best to translate what he's asking for into actual work requirements, I advised Marcus. Document everything he tells you in writing and ask for clarification when his instructions don't make sense. Marcus nodded, but I could see the frustration in his eyes. He was a skilled professional being managed by someone who spoke in buzzwords instead of concrete objectives. That afternoon, I was deep in vendor contract analysis when something caught my attention. The contract for our document management system had been modified 6 months ago, right around the time Richard started talking about bringing Tyler into the company. The modification added consulting services that weren't related to document management, and the billing rates were significantly higher than industry standards. I pulled up the invoice history for this vendor. Over the past 6 months, we'd been charged for consulting services that weren't clearly defined in the contract. The total came to nearly $48,000. For a mid-sized company like Meridian, that was substantial money being spent on vague, strategic consulting. My curiosity piqued. I began examining other vendor contracts more carefully. What I found made my stomach turn. 3 different vendors had similar modifications made to their contracts in the past 8 months. All of them included consulting services with inflated billing rates. All of them had invoices that were approved without the usual departmental review process. The common thread was Richard's signature on all the contract modifications. As CEO, he had the authority to approve vendor changes, but company policy required department head approval for operational contracts. Somehow, these modifications had bypassed that requirement. I printed the contract modifications and invoices, studying them at my desk. The consulting services were described in deliberately vague terms: strategic operational assessment, process optimization consulting, and organizational efficiency review. None of these services had produced deliverables that I could find in our system. More troubling was the timing. All of these contract modifications occurred after Richard announced his intention to bring Tyler into the company, but before Tyler officially started. It looked like someone was padding vendor contracts to create consulting fees for work that may not have actually been performed. I needed more information, but I had to be careful. My access privileges had been downgraded when I was demoted. I could no longer view all financial records or executive correspondence. However, I still had access to operational invoices and vendor communications through my analyst role. That evening, I stayed late to dig deeper into the vendor relationships. The building was quiet, with only security guards and a few dedicated workaholics remaining. I used my access to pull up email correspondence with the 3 vendors in question. What I discovered made my blood run cold. The email trail showed that Tyler had been in direct communication with these vendors for months before officially joining Meridian. He'd been negotiating consulting agreements using his Northwestern MBA credentials and identifying himself as an incoming executive at Meridian Financial Solutions. In one email thread with Dataflow Solutions, Tyler wrote, "As the incoming Chief Operations Officer, I'll be implementing comprehensive process improvements that will require specialized consulting support. My stepfather has indicated that budget approval won't be an issue for strategic initiatives." Another email to Streamline Systems included Tyler's recommendation for pre-implementation consulting that would ensure seamless integration when I assume operational leadership. The consulting fee for this pre-implementation work was $12,000. The third vendor, Optimal Business Solutions, had received even more explicit direction from Tyler. He'd outlined specific deliverables that aligned perfectly with MBA coursework he'd completed at Northwestern. It looked like he was using Meridian's vendor budget to pay for consulting work that supported his academic projects. I sat back in my chair, processing what I'd uncovered. Tyler hadn't just been handed an executive position through nepotism. He'd been orchestrating a scheme to funnel company money to vendors who were essentially paying him for consulting work that may have consisted of nothing more than his MBA homework. But the implications went deeper than Tyler's fraud. Richard had to know about these vendor modifications. His signature was on every contract amendment. Either he was complicit in the scheme, or he was signing off on financial commitments without proper oversight. I needed to document everything, carefully, but I also needed to understand the full scope of what was happening. If Tyler and Richard were manipulating vendor contracts, what other financial irregularities might exist? The next morning, I arrived early and began a systematic review of all vendor relationships that had been modified in the past year. The pattern was consistent and damning. 9 different vendors had received contract amendments that included consulting services with inflated rates. The total amount of questionable charges exceeded $130,000. More concerning was the discovery that some of these vendors didn't appear to have legitimate business operations. When I researched their business licenses and corporate filings, I found shell companies with minimal staff and no obvious expertise in the services they were allegedly providing to Meridian. Tyler was 10 minutes late to his first department meeting on Tuesday morning. He walked into the conference room with the confident stride of someone who'd never been held accountable for tardiness. The operations team was gathered around the table, notepads ready, and expressions ranging from skeptical to resigned. "Good morning, everyone," Tyler began, loosening his tie as if he'd been rushing to save lives instead of grabbing an expensive coffee from the lobby cafe. "I want to start by saying how excited I am to be working with such a talented team." Flattery felt hollow, especially since he'd never worked with any of us before assuming control of the department. "I've been reviewing our operational metrics," he continued, "and I see tremendous opportunities for improvement. We're going to implement some innovative strategies that will position us as industry leaders in operational efficiency." "Marcus," Thompson raised his hand, "what specific strategies are you referring to?" Tyler's confident expression flickered slightly. "I'm developing a comprehensive optimization framework that will leverage best practices from multiple industry sectors. We'll be moving toward a more agile methodology that emphasizes continuous improvement and stakeholder engagement." The room was silent. Tyler had just spent 2 minutes saying absolutely nothing in terms of concrete actions or objectives. Sarah Williams, our compliance specialist, tried a different approach. "Are there specific compliance considerations we should be aware of with these new strategies?" "Compliance will be integrated into our optimization framework," Tyler replied. "We'll be taking a holistic approach that ensures regulatory alignment while maximizing operational flexibility." I watched my former team members exchange glances. These were experienced professionals who were used to clear direction and specific objectives. Tyler's management style was all presentation and no substance. The meeting continued for another 30 minutes without producing a single actionable item. Tyler dismissed everyone with instructions to think strategically about optimization opportunities and schedule individual meetings with him throughout the week. As the team filed out, I noticed the frustration in their body language. These were people who took pride in their work and valued efficiency. Tyler's vague directives and buzzword-heavy communication style was already undermining morale. I spent the rest of the week documenting the vendor contract irregularities while completing Tyler's busy work assignments. The more I investigated, the clearer it became that this wasn't just nepotism or incompetence. This was fraud on a scale that could destroy Meridian Financial Solutions. By Friday afternoon, I had compiled evidence of systematic financial manipulation involving fake consulting contracts, inflated vendor fees, and shell companies with no legitimate business purpose. The total amount of fraudulent charges exceeded $200,000, and the scheme appeared to be ongoing. But I also realized I was in a precarious position. I was a recently demoted employee with access to sensitive financial information. If I raised concerns about Tyler's conduct, It could easily be dismissed as sour grapes from someone who'd been passed over for promotion. I needed allies, and I needed a strategy for exposing the fraud without destroying my own credibility. The company's annual external audit was scheduled for the following month. If I could find a way to ensure the auditors looked closely at vendor relationships and consulting contracts, they might uncover the irregularities independently. That weekend, I made copies of all the evidence I'd gathered and stored them securely, off-site. I also began researching Meridian's external auditing firm, Peterson & Associates, to understand their typical audit procedures and identify potential points of contact. What I discovered about Peterson & Associates would prove crucial to everything that followed. The firm had a reputation for thoroughness, but they also had a history of uncovering financial irregularities that their clients preferred to keep quiet. More importantly, I learned that Peterson & Associates had recently hired a new senior auditor, named Janet Foster, who specialized in vendor relationship audits and had previously exposed fraud at 2 other mid-sized financial firms. If I could find a way to direct Janet Foster's attention to Meridian's vendor contracts, she might uncover Tyler's scheme independently, but timing would be critical, and I'd need to be extremely careful about how I provided information without appearing to have an agenda. The wheels were already in motion for Tyler's downfall, but he had no idea what was coming. Neither did Richard, who'd enabled the fraud through his negligent oversight and preferential treatment of his stepson. As I prepared for another week in my cubicle, I felt something I hadn't experienced since the demotion: anticipation. Tyler Blackwood was about to learn that 20 years of institutional knowledge included understanding exactly how financial fraud gets exposed in the investment industry. Monday morning brought news that would accelerate my timeline dramatically. Diana Martinez approached my cubicle with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of anger and disbelief. "Margaret, we need to talk," she said quietly. "Conference room B is empty." I followed her down the hallway, wondering what could have prompted such urgency. Diana closed the door behind us and sat down heavily. "Tyler fired Amanda Rodriguez this morning," she said without preamble. My stomach dropped. Amanda was one of our most experienced compliance officers, a single mother who'd been with Meridian for 12 years. She was meticulous, reliable, and absolutely essential to our regulatory reporting. "On what grounds?" I asked. "Performance issues, according to Tyler. He claims she wasn't adapting to his new efficiency standards." Diana's voice was tight with controlled fury. "Margaret, Amanda's performance reviews have been outstanding for 8 straight years. She's never missed a compliance deadline, never had a regulatory violation. This is insane." I felt pieces clicking into place with sickening clarity. Amanda Rodriguez wasn't just a good employee. She was the person most likely to notice irregularities in vendor payments and consulting contracts. Her job required her to review all operational expenses for compliance purposes. Did Tyler give her any specific examples of performance problems? I asked. He said she was asking too many questions about new vendor relationships and slowing down approval processes with unnecessary oversight. Diana shook her head. "Since when is oversight unnecessary in a financial services company?" Since Tyler needed to eliminate anyone who might discover his fraud scheme. Amanda's termination wasn't about performance. It was about removing a potential threat to his vendor contract manipulation. "There's more," Diana continued. "Tyler announced that he's eliminating the compliance officer position entirely. He says we can handle compliance through our existing operational staff and save money on redundant roles." The audacity was breathtaking. Tyler was systematically dismantling the oversight mechanisms that could expose his fraud while claiming it was about operational efficiency. Without Amanda's careful review of vendor contracts and expense reports, his scheme could continue indefinitely. "Diana, this is bigger than just bad management decisions," I said carefully. "I think Tyler is making changes that could put the company at serious regulatory risk." She studied my face. "What do you mean?" I had to make a choice. I could continue investigating quietly and hope the external audit would uncover everything, or I could begin building an alliance with someone who had the authority to demand answers. Diana was still a department manager with access to financial records and the standing to ask legitimate questions about operational changes. "I've been reviewing vendor contracts as Tyler requested," I said. "I've found some irregularities that concern me from a compliance standpoint." "What kind of irregularities?" I outlined the contract modifications, the inflated consulting fees, and the shell companies that appeared to have no legitimate business operations. Diana listened with growing alarm as I explained the timeline and the amounts involved. "Margaret, if what you're telling me is accurate, this isn't just a compliance issue. This is potential fraud." "I know, but I'm a recently demoted employee with obvious reasons to be unhappy with Tyler. If I raise these concerns officially, they'll be dismissed as retaliation." Diana was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. Finally, she spoke. "What do you need from me?" "Access to the personnel files for Amanda's termination. I want to see Tyler's documented reasons for firing her. If my theory is correct, his justification will focus on her questions about vendor relationships. I can get you that information. What else?" "I need you to start asking questions about the compliance restructuring. As a department manager, you have the right to understand how regulatory oversight will be maintained without dedicated compliance staff." Diana nodded grimly. "I'll schedule a meeting with Tyler this afternoon." That evening, Diana forwarded me Amanda's termination documentation. Tyler's written justification was exactly what I'd expected. He cited Amanda's excessive scrutiny of routine vendor payments and her resistance to streamlined approval processes as primary performance issues. He'd also included a note that Amanda had repeatedly questioned the necessity of new consulting relationships that were approved at the executive level. In Tyler's mind, questioning executive decisions was insubordination rather than due diligence. The documentation confirmed my suspicions. Tyler had fired Amanda specifically because she was doing her job too well. Her termination was designed to eliminate oversight that could expose his fraudulent vendor relationships. But Tyler had made a critical error. By documenting his reasons for firing Amanda, he'd created a paper trail that actually supported my theory about his motivations. An experienced auditor would immediately recognize that firing a compliance officer for asking questions about vendor payments was a red flag. Tuesday morning brought another development that would prove crucial to the eventual audit. I received an email from Marcus Thompson requesting a meeting to discuss operational concerns. We met in a coffee shop 3 blocks from the office, away from potential eavesdropping. "Margaret, I need to talk to someone who understands what's happening," Marcus began. "Tyler's changes are creating chaos in the department, but it's more than just management style differences." He pulled out a folder containing printed emails and documents. "Tyler asked me to prepare a presentation for the board about operational improvements he's implemented. When I started compiling the data, I found some things that don't make sense." Marcus showed me Tyler's internal communications about cost savings and efficiency improvements. According to Tyler's reports to Richard, the operations department had reduced vendor costs by 15% while improving service quality through strategic consulting relationships. The problem was that none of Tyler's claimed improvements were actually happening. Vendor costs had increased, not decreased. Service quality metrics were declining across multiple areas. The strategic consulting relationships were generating reports that no one was using for actual operational decisions. "Tyler is lying to the board about his performance," Marcus concluded. "He's creating fictional improvements to justify his position and salary." This was the missing piece I needed. Tyler wasn't just stealing money through fraudulent vendor contracts. He was also lying to the board of directors about his effectiveness as an executive. The combination of fraud and false reporting would be devastating when exposed during an audit. "Marcus, I need you to document everything you've found, I said. Keep copies of all communications where Tyler asks you to prepare misleading reports or presents false information about departmental performance. Are you thinking about going to the board? Not directly, but I think the external audit next month is going to be very interesting. That afternoon, Diana met with Tyler to discuss compliance restructuring. She returned to my cubicle 2 hours later with a transcript of their conversation that she'd recorded on her phone. "Margaret, you need to hear this," she said, plugging in earbuds so I could listen privately. Tyler's voice came through clearly. "Diana, I understand your concerns about regulatory oversight, but you're thinking about this the old way. Modern operational management integrates compliance into workflow processes rather than treating it as a separate function. We don't need dedicated compliance staff when we have streamlined approval systems." Diana's response was pointed. "Tyler, Amanda Rodriguez caught 3 potential violations last quarter that could have resulted in significant fines. How will those issues be identified without her expertise?" "Those weren't real violations," Tyler replied dismissively. "Amanda was creating problems where none existed. She was flagging routine vendor payments and consulting agreements that were already approved at the executive level. That kind of second-guessing creates inefficiency and undermines executive authority." The recording continued for another 10 minutes, with Tyler repeatedly dismissing the importance of compliance oversight and characterizing Amanda's diligence as obstructionism. He explicitly stated that vendor relationships approved by Richard didn't require departmental review, which directly contradicted company policy. "Diana, this recording proves that Tyler fired Amanda for doing her job correctly," I said after listening to the entire conversation. "It also shows that he's deliberately eliminating oversight mechanisms that could expose problems with vendor relationships. What's our next step? We need to ensure this information reaches the external auditors, but we have to be careful about how we do it." I'd been researching Peterson and Associates and had learned that Janet Foster, their new senior auditor, had a reputation for following unusual leads when they suggested potential fraud. She'd uncovered embezzlement schemes at 2 previous clients by paying attention to employee concerns that management had dismissed. "I have an idea," I told Diana, "but it requires us to be very strategic about timing and documentation." Over the next week, Diana and I worked together to compile a comprehensive file of Tyler's questionable decisions and their impact on operational integrity. We documented Amanda's firing, the elimination of compliance oversight, Tyler's false reports to the board, and the suspicious vendor contract modifications. Marcus Thompson contributed additional evidence of Tyler's misrepresentations about departmental performance. He'd found emails where Tyler took credit for cost savings that had actually been implemented before his arrival, and where he attributed declining performance metrics to transition periods rather than acknowledging his management failures. The picture that emerged was damning. Tyler Blackwood wasn't just an incompetent nepotism hire. He was actively undermining operational integrity while stealing company money through fraudulent vendor relationships. But the most crucial discovery came from an unexpected source. Sarah Williams, the compliance specialist who'd remained in the department after Amanda's firing, approached me on Thursday with information that would prove explosive. "Margaret, I found something while cleaning out Amanda's files," she said, nervously. Amanda had been investigating some vendor payments before she was fired. She left notes that I think you should see. Amanda's notes revealed that she'd identified the same pattern of fraudulent vendor contracts that I'd discovered. But she'd gone further, tracing payment authorizations and discovering that some of the consulting fees were being transferred to accounts associated with Tyler's personal business ventures. Amanda had been building a case against Tyler when she was fired. Her notes included bank routing numbers, corporate registration documents, and a timeline that proved Tyler had been orchestrating the scheme for months before officially joining Meridian. "Sarah, did Amanda share these concerns with anyone before she was terminated?" She tried to schedule a meeting with Richard, but his assistant said he was too busy to discuss operational details. Amanda was planning to raise the issues during the external audit. The pieces were finally complete. Amanda Rodriguez had discovered Tyler's fraud scheme and attempted to report it through proper channels. When she couldn't get Richard's attention, she'd planned to present her findings to the external auditors. Tyler had fired her to prevent that presentation, but he hadn't known about her detailed documentation. Now I had Amanda's evidence, my own investigation, Diana's recordings, and Marcus's proof of false reporting to the board. The external audit was scheduled to begin in 10 days, and Janet Foster would be conducting the vendor relationship review. Tyler. Blackwood thought he'd eliminated the threat to his scheme by firing Amanda Rodriguez. What he didn't realize was that he'd actually created a paper trail that would expose not only his fraud, but also his attempts to cover it up. The stage was set for the audit that would bring down Tyler, implicate Richard in negligent oversight, and vindicate every employee who'd been harmed by their corruption. But first, I had to find a way to ensure Janet Foster saw all the evidence without compromising my own position or revealing the extent of our investigation. The Peterson and Associates team arrived on a crisp Monday morning in early May, their professional demeanor and serious expressions signaling that this would be no routine audit. Janet Foster led the group, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd seen every type of financial irregularity imaginable. I watched from my cubicle as Richard personally escorted the audit team to the conference room, his smile a bit too wide and his handshake lasting a moment too long. Tyler stood beside him, adjusting his tie and trying to project executive authority, despite having been in his role for less than 2 months. The operations department has undergone some exciting transformations recently, I heard Tyler tell Janet Foster as they passed my desk. I'd be happy to walk you through our new efficiency initiatives and cost optimization strategies. Janet nodded politely, but I caught something in her expression that suggested she'd heard similar promises from executives before. She was already taking notes, her pen moving quickly across a leather-bound notebook. Within an hour, Janet had requested access to all vendor contracts, payment authorizations, and operational expense reports for the past 18 months. She'd also asked for personnel files related to recent departmental changes, which would include Amanda Rodriguez's termination documentation. Diana Martinez found me during lunch break, her eyes bright with anticipation. Margaret, Janet Foster asked to interview several current and former operations staff members. She specifically requested to speak with anyone who'd been involved in vendor relationship management or compliance oversight. My pulse quickened. Did she mention Amanda by name? She did. She also asked about recent organizational changes and whether any employees had raised concerns about operational procedures. This was exactly what I'd hoped for. Janet Foster was following the investigative pattern that had made her successful at previous firms. She wasn't just reviewing financial documents, she was talking to the people who actually handled day-to-day operations. That afternoon, I received an email requesting a meeting with Janet Foster the following morning. The subject line was, simple, operational review discussion. But I knew this was my opportunity to ensure she found the evidence that Tyler thought he'd buried. I spent the evening carefully planning my approach. I couldn't appear to have an agenda or seem like a disgruntled employee seeking revenge. Instead, I needed to be a knowledgeable professional providing factual information about operational procedures and recent changes. Tuesday morning, I sat across from Janet Foster in a small conference room, her notebook open and her attention focused entirely on our conversation. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe early 40s, with graying hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to notice everything. Margaret, I understand you've been with Meridian for 20 years, she began. That gives you valuable perspective on how operational procedures have evolved over time. That's correct. I've seen the company grow from 40 employees to over 200, and I've been involved in developing most of our current operational systems. Tell me about recent changes in your department. I understand there's been some restructuring. I chose my words carefully. The most significant change was the creation of the Chief Operations Officer position and the elimination of our dedicated compliance officer role. We've also seen modifications to several vendor relationships and approval processes. Janet made notes. What's your assessment of how these changes have affected operational efficiency? From a procedural standpoint, the elimination of dedicated compliance oversight has created gaps in our review processes. Previously, all vendor payments and contract modifications went through a systematic compliance check. That safeguard no longer exists. Can you give me specific examples? This was the opening I'd been waiting for. I've noticed several vendor contracts that were modified to include consulting services with billing rates significantly above market standards. The modifications were approved without the departmental review that company policy typically requires. Janet's pen stopped moving. Which vendors? I provided the names of the 3 most egregious examples: Data Flow Solutions, Streamline Systems, and Optimal Business Solutions. I also mentioned that the consulting services described in these contracts seemed to overlap with services we were already receiving from existing vendors. Have you reviewed the deliverables from these consulting arrangements? That's part of what concerns me. I haven't been able to locate any deliverables or reports that justify the consulting fees we've been paying. The invoices are approved, but there's no evidence of work product. Janet made extensive notes. Who approves these invoices? They're approved directly by executive management, bypassing normal departmental oversight. And the compliance officer who was terminated, Amanda Rodriguez, what was her role in reviewing vendor relationships? Amanda was meticulous about vendor oversight. She reviewed all operational expenses for compliance purposes and often identified potential issues before they became problems. Her termination eliminated our primary safeguard against irregular vendor payments. Why was she terminated? I pulled out Tyler's written justification for Amanda's firing, which I'd brought copies of at Diana's suggestion. According to the termination documentation, she was fired for asking too many questions about vendor payments and consulting relationships. Janet read Tyler's written reasons carefully, her expression growing more serious with each paragraph. When she finished, she looked up at me with the focused attention of someone who'd just found a critical piece of evidence. Margaret, in your professional opinion, was Amanda Rodriguez's scrutiny of vendor payments excessive or inappropriate? In my experience, Amanda's level of oversight was exactly what you'd expect from a qualified compliance officer. Her questions were designed to ensure we were meeting regulatory requirements and company policy. Firing someone for doing their job thoroughly is unusual in this industry. The interview continued for another 30 minutes, with Janet asking detailed questions about approval processes, vendor selection criteria, and financial oversight mechanisms. I provided factual answers while ensuring she understood the gaps that Tyler's changes had created. When we finished, Janet shook my hand with a firm grip. Thank you for your time, Margaret. Your insights have been very helpful. As I walked back to my cubicle, I felt a mixture of relief and anticipation. I'd provided Janet Foster with the information she needed to investigate Tyler's vendor fraud, without appearing to have a personal agenda. Now, I had to trust that her professional expertise would lead her to the evidence that would expose everything. That afternoon, I learned that Janet had also interviewed Marcus Thompson, Sarah Williams, and Diana Martinez. Word spread quickly through the department that the auditor was asking very specific questions about vendor relationships and compliance procedures. Tyler seemed oblivious to the danger he was in. He spent the afternoon in meetings with Richard, apparently discussing how to present the operations department's improvements to the audit team. I overheard him telling his assistant to prepare a presentation highlighting cost savings and efficiency gains. Wednesday morning brought the first sign that Janet Foster had found what she was looking for. She requested access to all email communications between operations staff and the 3 vendors I'd identified. She also asked for bank records showing payment authorizations and fund transfers to these vendors. More ominously for Tyler, she requested access to his email account and calendar for the period before he officially joined Meridian. She wanted to review all communications related to vendor relationships and consulting arrangements. Richard's confidence began to waver when Janet informed him that she needed to examine all executive-level vendor approvals for the past year. She also requested documentation showing how the company ensured compliance with regulatory requirements after eliminating the compliance officer position. By Thursday, the audit had shifted from routine review to intensive investigation. Janet Foster had brought in additional resources from Peterson and Associates, including a forensic accountant who specialized in vendor fraud schemes. I watched Tyler's demeanor change throughout the week. His confident swagger had been replaced by nervous energy and frequent trips to Richard's office. He'd stopped scheduling meetings with the operations team and seemed to spend most of his time behind closed doors. The breakthrough came on Thursday afternoon when Janet Foster discovered the connection between Tyler's personal business ventures and the shell companies receiving consulting payments. Amanda Rodriguez's hidden investigation had provided the account numbers and corporate registrations that proved money was being funneled from Meridian to entities controlled by Tyler. Diana Martinez was the first to hear about the discovery. Janet Foster had requested an emergency meeting with Diana to verify operational procedures and confirm that the consulting services being paid for weren't actually being performed. Margaret, Janet asked me directly whether we've received any strategic reports or operational assessments from Data Flow Solutions, Streamline Systems, or Optimal Business Solutions, Diana told me in a hushed conversation by the coffee machine. What? Did you tell her? The truth. We've never received any deliverables from those companies. The consulting fees were being paid for services that don't exist. That evening, I stayed late to finish some reports, but I was really hoping to observe what happened when the building was mostly empty. Around 7 o'clock, I saw Richard and Tyler having an intense conversation in Richard's office, their voices raised enough to carry through the closed door. 20 minutes later, Tyler emerged looking shaken. He gathered some personal items from his office and left the building without saying goodbye to anyone. It was the last time any of us would see him as an employee of Meridian Financial Solutions. Friday morning, Richard called an emergency meeting for all operations staff. His face was grim as he stood before the group that had been Tyler's direct reports just days earlier. I need to inform you that Tyler Blackwood's employment with Meridian has been terminated effective immediately, he announced. We're cooperating fully with an ongoing investigation into operational irregularities that came to light during our external audit. The room was silent. Everyone understood that operational irregularities was corporate speak for something much more serious. Diana Martinez will be assuming oversight of the operations department while we conduct a search for permanent leadership, Richard continued. I want to assure everyone that this situation doesn't reflect on your professional performance or job security. After the meeting, Diana pulled me aside with news that confirmed everything we'd suspected. Margaret, Janet Foster told me privately, that they've uncovered evidence of systematic fraud involving vendor contracts and consulting payments. The total amount exceeds $300,000, and it appears to have been ongoing for over a year. What happens next? Peterson and Associates is recommending that the company contact law enforcement. They believe the fraud scheme involves money laundering through shell companies, which makes it a federal crime. I felt a surge of vindication mixed with sadness. Tyler Blackwood had destroyed his own career through greed and incompetence, but he'd also damaged the lives of good people like Amanda Rodriguez, who'd tried to do their jobs with integrity. There's something else, Diana continued. Janet Foster specifically mentioned that employee interviews were crucial to uncovering the fraud. She said that without insider knowledge of operational procedures, they might not have known where to look for evidence. The audit had exposed everything, just as I'd hoped. But the investigation was far from over. Tyler's termination was just the beginning of a legal process that would ultimately involve criminal charges, civil lawsuits, and a complete overhaul of Meridian's operational oversight procedures. Richard Blackwood's role in enabling the fraud would soon come under scrutiny as well. His negligent approval of vendor contracts and dismissal of compliance concerns had made Tyler's scheme possible. The board of directors would have to decide whether Richard could remain as CEO after such a massive failure of oversight. As for me, I was still sitting in a cubicle on the 12th floor, but everything had changed. The audit had vindicated my concerns and exposed the corruption that had cost me my position. Now I had to decide what justice looked like and whether Meridian Financial Solutions could earn back my trust and loyalty. The following Monday brought news that would reshape Meridian Financial Solutions forever. FBI agents arrived at the building at 9:15, their unmarked vehicles drawing curious stares from employees arriving for work. I watched from my cubicle window as federal investigators carried boxes of evidence from the executive floor. Within 2 hours, Richard Blackwood was escorted from the building in handcuffs. The sight of our CEO being led away by federal agents sent shockwaves through the entire company. Employees gathered in small groups, whispering about what this meant for their jobs and the company's future. Diana Martinez called an emergency department meeting, her face pale but determined. She'd been thrust into leadership during the company's worst crisis, but she handled it with the professionalism I'd always respected in her. "I know everyone has questions about what's happening," she began. "What I can tell you is that the FBI is investigating financial crimes that appear to involve former executives. The company is cooperating fully with law enforcement." Marcus Thompson raised his, "And what does this mean for our day-to-day operations?" "We continue doing our jobs," Diana replied firmly. "Our clients depend on us, and we have obligations to meet regardless of what's happening at the executive level. The board of directors is meeting today to establish interim leadership and ensure business continuity." After the meeting, Diana approached me privately. "Margaret, the board wants to speak with you this afternoon. They're trying to understand how the fraud went undetected for so long, and your name came up as someone who raised early concerns." My stomach tightened. Speaking to the board of directors about the fraud meant potentially exposing my role in the investigation, but it also represented an opportunity to ensure that the full truth came out. The board meeting took place in the company's main conference room, with 5 directors participating via video conference and 3 attending in person. Board Chairman William Hayes, a distinguished man in his 60s, led the discussion. "Ms. Chen, we understand you've been with Meridian for 20 years and have extensive knowledge of operational procedures," he began. "We're trying to understand how such significant fraud could occur without triggering our internal controls." I chose my words carefully. The fraud was possible because normal oversight mechanisms were systematically eliminated. When Tyler Blackwood became COO, he fired our compliance officer and restructured approval processes to bypass departmental reviews. "Were you aware of these changes at the time they occurred?" "Yes, and I had concerns about them." Amanda Rodriguez was an excellent compliance officer whose termination left a significant gap in our oversight capabilities. Board member Elizabeth Carter, participating via video, leaned forward. "Did you or other employees raise these concerns with executive management?" Amanda attempted to schedule meetings with Richard to discuss vendor payment irregularities, but she was told he was too busy. Her termination occurred shortly after she began asking questions about consulting contracts. The board members exchanged glances. William Hayes made notes before continuing. "Ms. Chen, the external auditors indicated that employee interviews were crucial to uncovering the fraud. Can you elaborate on what information was provided during those interviews?" I explained how Janet Foster's questions had focused on operational procedures and recent changes, and how I'd provided factual information about vendor contracts and compliance gaps. I was careful to emphasize that I'd simply answered questions honestly rather than actively investigating fraud. "In your professional opinion," asked board member Robert Kim. Could this fraud have been prevented with proper oversight? Absolutely. Amanda Rodriguez had already identified suspicious vendor payments before her termination. If she'd been allowed to complete her investigation, or if normal compliance procedures had remained in place, the fraud would have been discovered much earlier. The meeting continued for another hour, with board members asking detailed questions about operational procedures, vendor management, and the timeline of Tyler's changes. By the end, it was clear that they understood the fraud had been enabled by deliberate elimination of safeguards rather than simple oversight failures. 3 days later, the Seattle Times published a front-page article about the Meridian scandal. The headline read, "Investment firm CEO arrested in $300,000 fraud scheme involving Stepson." The article detailed Tyler's fake consulting contracts, Richard's negligent oversight, and the FBI's ongoing investigation into money laundering charges. Reading about my professional life in the newspaper was surreal. The article mentioned that longtime employees had raised concerns about operational changes that eliminated fraud detection mechanisms. I wasn't named, but I recognized my own words in some of the quotes attributed to anonymous sources. The media attention brought unexpected consequences. By Thursday, I'd received 3 phone calls from executive recruiters who'd seen the news coverage and were interested in my background. Word had spread in the financial services industry that Meridian's longtime operations director had tried to maintain proper oversight despite executive interference. "Margaret, I represent a client looking for an experienced operations executive," said Rachel Kim from Northwest Executive Search. "Your reputation for integrity and operational excellence has come to our attention. Would you be interested in discussing opportunities?" For the first time in months, I felt a spark of professional optimism. The fraud scandal that had destroyed Tyler and Richard's careers was actually enhancing my reputation in the industry. People understood that I'd been demoted for asking the right questions, not for failing to perform. Friday brought the news I'd been hoping for since Tyler's termination. William Hayes called me personally to request a meeting about Meridian's operational leadership needs. We met in a downtown restaurant, away from the office and media attention. William was direct in his approach. "Margaret, the board has been reviewing how to rebuild operational leadership at Meridian. We need someone with institutional knowledge, proven integrity, and the respect of the operational staff." I waited, not wanting to appear presumptuous about where this conversation was heading. "We'd like to offer you the position of Chief Operations Officer," he continued, "the same role that Tyler held, but with proper oversight mechanisms and board accountability." The irony was perfect. Tyler's fraud scheme had ultimately resulted in me getting the promotion he'd stolen from me, but now I'd be earning it through merit rather than nepotism. "I'm interested," I said carefully, "but I have conditions." William raised an eyebrow. "What kind of conditions?" "First, I want Amanda Rodriguez rehired as our compliance officer with full authority to investigate any operational irregularities. Second, I want all vendor contracts reviewed and renegotiated to ensure we're getting legitimate value for our payments. Third, I want board oversight of all operational changes that affect financial controls." William smiled. "Those aren't conditions, Margaret. Those are exactly the reforms we were hoping you'd implement." The following Monday, I walked back into my corner office for the first time in 3 months. My personal items had been returned. The furniture was familiar, and the view of Elliott Bay looked exactly the same. But everything else had changed. Amanda Rodriguez was back at her desk, reviewing vendor contracts with the thoroughness that had made Tyler so nervous. The operations team was energized by the return of proper leadership and clear communication. Diana Martinez had been promoted to Deputy Operations Director, a new position created to ensure proper succession planning. My first official act as COO was to call a department meeting where I addressed the elephant in the room directly. "I know, the past few months have been difficult for everyone," I began. We've seen good people fired for doing their jobs correctly, and we've seen bad actors rewarded for deceptive behavior. That ends now. I outlined the new operational procedures that would prevent future fraud: mandatory compliance reviews for all vendor contracts, board oversight of executive spending, and whistleblower protections for employees who identified potential irregularities. Most importantly, I concluded, we're going to rebuild a culture where asking questions is valued, not punished. Our job is to protect this company and our clients through rigorous oversight and professional excellence. The applause was spontaneous and genuine. These were professionals who'd been frustrated by months of Tyler's incompetent leadership and suspicious behavior. They were ready to return to the standards of excellence that had made Meridian successful. Over the following weeks, Amanda's investigation uncovered additional vendor irregularities that Tyler had initiated but hadn't fully implemented. We recovered nearly $50,000 in overpayments and terminated contracts with 3 shell companies that existed solely to collect consulting fees. The legal proceedings against Tyler and Richard would continue for months, but the operational recovery was immediate. Client confidence returned as word spread that Meridian had addressed the fraud comprehensively and implemented stronger controls. 6 months later, I stood in my corner office reviewing quarterly reports that showed the operations department performing at record levels. Employee satisfaction scores had reached all-time highs, compliance violations remained at 0, and operational costs had decreased by 12% through legitimate efficiency improvements. Tyler Blackwood had ultimately pleaded guilty to federal fraud and money laundering charges, receiving a 4-year prison sentence and restitution orders that would follow him for decades. Richard faced separate charges for conspiracy and breach of fiduciary duty, with his trial scheduled for the following year. As for me, I'd learned that sometimes the worst professional setback can become the catalyst for the greatest career advancement. Tyler's greed and Richard's negligence had temporarily derailed my career, but they'd also created opportunities that might never have existed otherwise. The young woman who'd started as an entry-level analyst 20 years earlier had finally become the executive she'd always been capable of being. And this time, I'd earned the position through integrity, competence, and the courage to ask difficult questions when everyone else preferred comfortable silence. 1 year after Tyler Blackwood walked into my office and destroyed my career, I stood at the podium of the Pacific Northwest Financial Services Conference, delivering a keynote address on corporate governance and fraud prevention. The irony wasn't lost on me that my expertise in detecting financial crimes had made me a sought-after speaker in the industry. The audience of 200 financial executives listened intently as I shared lessons learned from the Meridian scandal, without naming specific individuals or companies. Professional ethics prevented me from sensationalizing the story, but the principles were universal enough to resonate with anyone who'd seen good governance eroded by poor leadership. Fraud doesn't happen overnight, I explained to the audience. It develops gradually through the systematic elimination of oversight mechanisms and the silencing of employees who ask uncomfortable questions. The warning signs are always there, but they're only visible to organizations that value transparency over comfort. After my presentation, several executives approached with questions about implementing stronger controls in their own companies. One woman, Linda Chen from Portland Financial Group, pulled me aside with a story that sounded depressingly familiar. "Margaret, we have a new VP who's made changes that worry our compliance team, but senior management isn't interested in hearing concerns. How do you recommend we address potential issues before they become scandals?" I gave her the same advice I wished someone had given me 2 years earlier. Document everything, build alliances with trustworthy colleagues, and never assume that loyalty to bad leadership serves the company's best interests. The professional recognition was gratifying, but the personal satisfaction came from rebuilding Meridian's operations department into something stronger than it had ever been. Our quarterly compliance scores consistently ranked in the top 5% of similar firms, and our operational efficiency metrics had become benchmarks that other companies tried to emulate. Amanda Rodriguez had become my closest ally in maintaining the highest standards of oversight. Her near firing for doing her job correctly had made her even more determined to catch irregularities before they became problems. She'd uncovered 3 potential vendor issues in the past year, all resolved quickly through proper channels. "Margaret, I got a call from the SEC today," Amanda told me during our weekly review meeting. "They want to interview us about best practices for vendor oversight. Apparently, our fraud prevention protocols are being studied as a model for other investment firms." The Securities and Exchange Commission's interest was the ultimate validation of the changes we'd implemented. Federal regulators were using Meridian's recovery as an example of how companies should respond to governance failures. Marcus Thompson had also thrived under the new leadership structure. His analytical skills and institutional knowledge made him invaluable in developing the risk assessment protocols that had caught the attention of industry experts. He'd been promoted to senior risk manager, a position that utilized his talents far better than Tyler's vague efficiency projects ever had. "You know what's strange?" Marcus said during a team lunch celebrating our latest compliance certification. "Tyler's fraud scheme actually made us better at our jobs. We're more careful, more thorough, and more questioning of authority than we ever were before." He was right. The trauma of seeing good employees punished for doing their jobs correctly had made the entire team more vigilant about protecting operational integrity. We'd learned that sometimes the most dangerous threat to a company comes from its own leadership. The legal proceedings against Tyler and Richard had finally concluded 6 months earlier. Tyler's 4-year federal prison sentence had made headlines in the business press, particularly because prosecutors had proven that his consulting fraud scheme had been planned before he'd even graduated from Northwestern. Richard's trial had been more complex, involving questions about executive negligence versus criminal conspiracy. The jury ultimately convicted him on 3 counts of breach of fiduciary duty, but acquitted him of the more serious conspiracy charges. His 2-year sentence and lifetime ban from serving as an officer of any publicly traded company effectively ended his business career. More importantly for the employees they'd harmed, both men faced substantial civil judgments. Tyler was required to pay full restitution to Meridian plus punitive damages that would follow him for decades. Richard lost his executive pension and severance package, with those funds redirected to compensate employees who'd been wrongfully terminated or demoted. I'd received a settlement check for the salary differential from my demotion, plus compensation, for the emotional distress of being wrongfully punished for questioning vendor irregularities. The money was substantial enough to pay off my mortgage early, but the real value was the official acknowledgement that I'd been right to raise concerns. Amanda had received an even larger settlement, along with a formal apology from the board of directors for her wrongful termination. She'd used part of the money to complete a master's degree in forensic accounting, making her even more valuable in detecting financial irregularities. The board had also implemented comprehensive governance reforms that went far beyond what federal regulations required. Every vendor contract over $10,000 now required independent compliance review. Executive spending was subject to quarterly board audits. Most importantly, the company had established an anonymous whistleblower system with external oversight to ensure that employee concerns reached appropriate authorities. "Margaret, I have some news that might interest you," William Hayes told me during our quarterly board review. "Peterson and Associates has recommended Meridian for the National Association of Investment Firms Governance Excellence Award. They specifically cited our recovery from the fraud scandal as a model for industry best practices. The recognition was meaningful because it came from our peers rather than self-promotion. Other companies were studying how we'd rebuilt operational integrity after such a devastating governance failure. But perhaps the most satisfying development was watching the career trajectories of the employees who'd been caught up in Tyler's destructive leadership. Sarah Williams had been promoted to senior compliance analyst. Jennifer Walsh, my former assistant, had been accepted into the company's management training program. Diana Martinez had become one of the youngest department heads in Meridian's history. These were people who'd been demoralized and confused by Tyler's incompetent management, but who'd found their footing again under leadership that valued their contributions and respected their expertise. The industry recognition had also opened doors I'd never expected. 3 different companies had approached me about chief executive positions, recognizing that someone who'd successfully navigated such a complex crisis might be valuable in preventing similar problems elsewhere. I'd turned down all the offers. Meridian had become more than just my employer. It was proof that companies could recover from leadership failures if they were willing to embrace accountability and change. Leaving now would feel like abandoning the culture we'd worked so hard to rebuild. 2 weeks ago, I'd received a letter that provided the perfect closure to the entire experience. It was from Tyler Blackwood, writing from federal prison. The letter was surprisingly thoughtful, free of the arrogance and entitlement that had characterized his brief tenure at Meridian. He acknowledged the harm he'd caused to employees and clients, took full responsibility for his fraudulent actions, and expressed genuine remorse for destroying the careers of people who'd tried to maintain professional standards. "I understand if you never forgive me," he'd written, "but I wanted you to know that I recognize how wrong I was to fire Amanda and demote you for doing your jobs correctly. Your integrity exposed my corruption, and I'm grateful that you prevented even greater damage to the company." I'd read the letter twice before filing it away. Forgiveness would take time, but the acknowledgement was a start. Standing in my corner office as the sun set over Elliott Bay, I reflected on the journey that had brought me back to this view. 21 years at the same company, with a detour through the worst professional crisis of my life that had ultimately led to the greatest validation of my career. Tyler Blackwood had intended to use nepotism and fraud to fast-track his way to executive success. Instead, he'd created a case study in how corruption destroys careers while integrity builds them. His 4-year prison sentence would end eventually, but the reputation he'd destroyed would follow him forever. As for me, I've learned that sometimes the most important battles are fought not for promotion or recognition, but for the simple right to do your job with honesty and professionalism. When those principles are under attack, defending them becomes more valuable than any corner office or executive title. The kid who'd walked into my office with unearned confidence and criminal intentions had inadvertently taught me the most important lesson of my career: that real success comes not from who you know or how well you can manipulate systems, but from the strength to stand up for what's right, even when it costs you everything. And sometimes, if you're very fortunate, standing up for what's right ultimately gives you everything back, with interest. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.